Welcome to a new English lesson. In this lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more grammar. Before we start, what do you think these objects are? It's not a pencil. It's not a marker. It's a chalk holder. In the past, when people studied at school, they would use chalk instead of markers, right? On the whiteboard or on the board they had, or the blackboard. So they used chalk, but in order to not get all their hands full of chalk, they would have a chalk holder. This is another object from the past. And do you guess what it is? It's not a mirror. It's not a selfie stick either. It's an overhead projector. So in the past, you would put an acetate page with an image, and this would project it on the wall and make it bigger. It was a way of showing images in the past. Now here you will see there's a new object in the middle of the class. Well, a different object in the middle of the class. Do you know what it is and what was it used for? It's not an oven. Okay, so officially it's a furnace. It was made to heat a classroom when it was very cold because of the weather, right? So they would have the heater in the middle of the class to get the classroom hot. It had fire in it, right? And coal. Okay, so that's an introduction. Today, we're going to talk about comparing schools from the past and present using more. Okay, so let's see. How was school in the past? Well, you probably have heard stories from your grandparents or your parents. I've heard a lot that classrooms were bigger than today. The boards were wider than nowadays. And students ate healthier than now. Now here we can remember comparisons, right? Because we have bigger than, we have the adjective big. Since it's a monosyllable between two consonants, we double the consonant that is at the end and we add er. We're bigger. Then we have we're wider. Wide is an adjective with two syllables. And it ends in e, so we only added the r. We're wider than, right? And here we have students ate healthier than now. So we're talking about healthy, right? It's a two-syllable word. And we add IER. But now, how do we make a comparison with an adjective that has more than two syllables? We'll see that today. Further on, let's see. So, school then and now. So let's look at this picture. As you can see, there are a lot of students. They're in rows. Some students are in pairs, sitting in pairs. Do they look motivated? They knew there was a picture. This guy even looks as he was sleeping, right? And you see this big white object in the middle of the class. It must have been difficult for the people behind it to pay attention in class and to copy and take notes, right? So it's a classroom furnace, as I was telling you before, right? To keep the classroom a little bit warmer in the days when it was very hot, but when it was very cold. But in summer, probably they had the window open, like in this case, and it didn't have any use. So let's see, school then and now. School has changed a lot with time. In the beginning of the last century, it was more difficult to register in schools than now. Teachers were more old-fashioned and strict than today. Now, lessons are more interesting than then. Life was more difficult then than in the 21st century. So, opinions may vary. Some people may think that it was better in the past. But if you see, we can see that, for example, less people could go to school. Even though if it was public, you had to have some resources to be able to buy a notebook, buy a book, buy pencils or your materials. Teachers were more old-fashioned, they were more strict, and they knew a lot, and they were respected a lot also. And lessons now, well, have a lot of technology and resources, so probably it's more motivating and engaging to be in a classroom today than in the past. So now let's analyze the paragraph. Do you find things that are similar? Probably you'll notice that we have more, right? That's correct. And you're going to notice that we're comparing. For example, in the beginning of the last century, in comparisons to now. Or how teachers were in the past and how they are today. How lessons are now more interesting than then. And how life was more difficult then in the 20th or 19th century than in the 21st century. So we're making comparisons. That's why we will always find the word than, right? But notice something else. We have some adjectives. We have difficult, old-fashioned in an old style. We have more interesting and difficult, right? Well, we already mentioned difficult before. So let's see. Notice that we have, if you put your hand under your chin and you say difficult, you'll notice it has 3 syllables. The same thing with old-fashioned. You have old-fashioned. It has 3 syllables. Interesting. Okay, same thing, 3 syllables. So we can say that we are using comparisons and we're using more with adjectives that have 3 syllables. But there are more rules about the use of comparisons with adjectives that have 3 syllables. Let's take a look. First, comparisons with more. Most adjectives with 3 or more syllables take more, obviously when we're comparing. For example, more difficult, more expensive. You have to pay more for something, right? Good. Some 2-syllable adjectives that end in a consonant take more. For example, more modern. This one has 2 syllables, modern. But notice that they end in a consonant. Afraid, the same thing, 2 syllables, but you can use more with it when you're making a comparison. Why? Because it ends in a consonant again. And there are 2-syllable adjectives that end in full and which always take more. For example, more useful. They have 2 syllables, but they end in full. More helpful, the same idea, right? So those are the 3 key rules that you need to take into account if you're making a comparison with more. Let's see if we understand. We have some sentences now, and you have to identify if the sentences are correct. So you're gonna tell me if they are correct or not, saying if they are true or false. Life was more expensive back then. Classrooms were more old-fashioned 100 years ago. Desks were more beautiful than today. And lessons were more interesting then. So let's see. Life was more expensive back then? You had to pay more? We're going to check it. Classrooms were more old-fashioned 100 years ago? Desks were more beautiful, more like handmade with more detail than today? And were classes really more interesting? We already mentioned this in the text before. So let's check. So the first one is false. Why? Because it was cheaper in the past to buy things in a way, right? So things were not as expensive as today. You've heard your parents or your grandparents saying that probably a notebook was worth 10 cents or something like that. Classrooms were more old-fashioned. That's true. 100 years ago. Desks were more beautiful than today. I would say it's true because people would take more care of or take a little bit more care of how they did things in an artful way, right? Or in an artistical way. And finally, lessons were more interesting then. I would say that is false because now we motivate more students to use different resources and to use things from real life or see things from real life to learn. A couple more. Students were more respectful with their teachers. Students were more afraid to participate in class. So students were more respectful? Yes, I would say that's true because they respected teachers a little bit more. And students were more afraid to participate in class? In a way, it's true because, as we said, teachers were a little bit more strict and you would get a penance, right, if you didn't answer correctly. Now, if you see, here we're using more expensive, 3 syllables in this adjective. Old-fashioned, 3 syllables. Beautiful, 3 syllables. And interesting, 3 syllables. In this one, we have respectful. It ends in full. So we're using this 2-syllable adjective to make the comparison. And here we're using afraid and it ends in a consonant, as we were saying before. Okay, I hope this video helps you to learn more about how to make comparisons with more. Take care. Bye.